Okay, so this is the review for The Demon Lover by Elizabeth Bowen. So The Demon Lover is an allegory. The story is allegorical, meaning that the symbols directly connect with specific historical events. So the basic premise of The Demon Lover is that Kathleen Drover, the main character, had a fiance during World War One. He went off to World War One and never came home, was missing in action and presumed dead. At the beginning of the story, it becomes clear that possibly this man has returned either in real life or from the supernatural. As the title implies, he's a demon from hell, returned from the dead. So the whole story is symbolic of the horror, the terror of World War One resurfacing again during the period of World War II. So that's symbolically what the Demon Lover represents. Okay, now on your study guide, the story takes place in World War II when the population of London was enduring frequent raids and bombings from Germany. Many people fled the city to find safety elsewhere. Mrs. Drover, Kathleen, has returned to her home from the countryside to check on her home and to collect some items. Now, I'm going to show you quickly that it was very common during this period to write about the terror of these bombs in the language of ghost stories or horror. Okay, this is just a little blurb. During the Blitz, so long as I remained indoors, I was ceaselessly assaulted by what psychiatrists so unfeelingly describe as irrational fears. But on escape onto the wide open spaces, they were promptly transformed into the patter of shrapnel, into anxieties to which my reason afforded every justification. So this is from a man named Osbert Lancaster, who was a cartoonist who lived in London through this period. As Osbert Lancaster recalled in his autobiography, fear was central to the civilian experience of London during the Second World War. As the term "the People's War" suggested, the British war effort depended not only on conscripted and directed labor and the rationing of consumer goods, but also on the fortitude of civilians, particularly those in urban areas, who were constant potential targets for German bombing raids. So what that meant was that the people of London lived in the fear that any whistle they heard in the distance, any bomb that they could imagine might destroy them, their family, their homes. There was a constant fear that at any moment you could be exploded. And that had a huge psychological impact for anyone living in the city during this time period. Mrs. Drover, her anxieties and her terror about the possibility of her abusive fiance returning, again, that's all symbolic for the fear, the inescapable fear and terror that the population of London endured during World War II. Okay, so in the story, Mrs. Drover comes into her home. It has been locked and there's been no visitors, no one inside. Even the caretaker has not been around. When she walks into her home, she immediately sees a letter that seems to have appeared from nowhere. No human hand, we're told, could have put it on the table. Mrs. Drover feels as if she is being watched. No human eye watched Mrs. Drover return. Those lines tell us that, on the one hand, no one is in the home. No one could have put the letter, delivered the letter inside. But the possibility here, what this implies is, of course, that something inhuman is watching Mrs. Drover, something unnatural. The letter indicates a planned meeting that she knows nothing about. I'm just going to go to the story here. Okay, so in this opening paragraph, okay, she looks into her home. She sees the cat weaving itself in and out of the railings. No human eye watches her return. She goes to the staircase. Having been boarded up, no light comes down the hall. She went quickly through the room. Now the prosaic woman looking about her was more perplexed than she knew by everything she saw, traces of her former habit of life. So she's both at home in the house, but also something seems off. She has a strange feeling that this is not her home, not her life. And she, as the story continues, that feeling of strangeness, that worry, that tension increases. She becomes more and more anxious as the story moves along. Okay. Now, the letter here that she discovers inexplicably in her home reads, "Dear Kathleen, you will not have forgotten that today is our anniversary and the day that we said. The years have gone by at once slowly and fast. In view of the fact that nothing has changed, I shall rely on you to keep your promise. I was sorry to see you leave London, but I was satisfied that you would be back in time. You may expect me, therefore, at the hour arranged. Until then." Okay. Now, immediately, Mrs. Drover, again, Kathleen, flashes back to her memory of this long-lost boyfriend. She's now 44, married to Mr. Drover with children. But at this point in the story, she starts thinking of her time as a young girl talking to her fiance in the garden. And notice here, she can't see his face. Okay, had not even completely seen his face. So remember, in The Rocking Horse Winter, we talked about Freud and the unconscious. When she is thinking of this memory before her former fiance left, she can recall parts of him and the conversation, but she can't recall the very detail of what he looked like, which means that she was afraid of him or traumatized by him in some way and has pushed that part of him into her unconscious. So what she does remember is this moment here where he is making her promise to stay true to him, to always remember him, wait for him. And he says he will always return to her. As he is doing that, he is pressing her hand directly on his breast buttons of his uniform and cutting the palm of her hand. That principally is what she remembers. So if you've ever heard of a blood oath or a blood pact, that's what's happening here. He's making her promise with blood that she will always wait for him. What she can remember in her conscious mind is the spectral glittering of his eye, which that is the language of the supernatural, spectral. He seems to be even ghostly in her memory. So the question is, why does she agree to marry this man? It has to do with fear. She is worried about him. She's always trying to twist out of his hands and run back to his mother and sister. longing to be with them in the safety of their company. But again, she is afraid of him, so she promises. Now, what this implies here is that she is hoping a little bit that she will not have to keep this promise. Like so many men in World War I, they didn't come back. And so she is possibly hoping that that will be the case and she won't have to pay up by marrying him. She does seem to, in this paragraph here, behaved well when her fiance was reported missing and presumed killed. She kind of plays the part of the sympathetic, brave young woman who has tragically lost her fiance. She enjoys that attention. Okay, but again, she's probably relieved. The implication is that she's relieved that she never had to marry him. Then along comes William Drover. She's just on the verge of becoming a spinster. She's kind of an older wife, but Mrs. Drover comes along and they are married. In the house, the years pile up. So it doesn't seem like this is a very romantic relationship. We don't describe romance in those terms. The years pile up. Her children were born and they lived until they were driven out by the bombs. So the entire marriage and her life, as Mrs. Drover, is summed up in these 3 lines. So not much to speak of, really, it seems. But now that she is alone and the possibility of her scary fiancé returning sends her into a panic. Okay, she considers the supernatural way that the letter seems to have materialized in her home. And she gets more and more afraid until she decides she's got to run away back to her little boys, her sister, and her husband. And that's when she decides to get the taxi. Okay, and the taxi, what that will provide is not just escape from the possibility of having to confront this person from the past, but also that she won't be alone any longer, that she will have someone, the taxi cab driver, to keep her company. Okay, so at the end of the story, okay, the driver turns around when she finally gets in the taxi, and what she sees eye to eye is that same spectral glittering, and she realizes that she is being abducted by the demon lover, her former fiance. And her mouth hangs open as she starts to scream, and he whisks her howling off into the streets of London, possibly taking her back to hell if he is a supernatural creature. Okay. So in the flashback, just to review, Mrs. Drover, Kathleen remembers saying goodbye to her former fiance. He has spectral, glittering eyes, and she cannot remember her face. Specifically, think back to Freud and traumatic memories. And she is filled with terror at him and the possibility of him returning. She longs to escape back to her family. And he pushes her hand in the flashback to his button, symbolically implying that she is promising with blood to always be true to him. He promises, I shall be with you sooner or later. Kathleen promises to be true to him. And of course, what she's hoping is possibly that he's going to be killed in war and she won't have to make do on this promise. Okay, so as I said before, this whole story is on one level just a ghost story. The monster is inside the home, so to speak. But what makes it fit in with the modern stories of this unit is the fact that the whole thing is a metaphor for the terror of war. Okay, all right, and that is the study guide review for The Demon Lover.